Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre and to the inaugural Kill Your Darlings Book Club evening, where you get to see the whites of the eyes of the authors that I'm sure you've been industriously reading. Tonight we're joined by Martin McKenzie-Murray, whose first book, Murder Without a Motive, has just been published by Scribe. Murder Without a Motive, however, retells the story of two 19-year-olds, both born in England, both living in the suburbs of Perth, who meet one night in a pub, in a group, and by chance peel off from it and wend their way towards her home. 50 metres from there, James Duggan strangles Rebecca Ryle, half strips the body and runs off. It happens to be the neighbourhood of Perth in which Martin grew up. His brother was acquainted with James Duggan, and he underwent similar rites of suburban passage. Martin, can you tell us something about your connection to, as it were, the first draft of history that you subsequently worked on?
It began with a personal proximity, as you lightly suggested, with my brother's acquaintance with Duggan. I say acquaintance, which seems kind of cute. They were social rivals. The last time my brother had seen the man convicted of Rebecca's killing, he'd beaten him. My brother had beaten James to the ground. So they were social rivals, and they were entwined by mutual friends. So my brother had known him for 6 or 7 years, and had long suspected him of carrying what he in fact carried, which was this latent violence. He demonstrated petty violence, petty theft, vandalism. He was an irritable, inarticulate, his frustration inchoate. But Cameron suspected that might have been even darker. So they were in each other's orbit for some time. And as for me, our environment was the same. So Rebecca's death initially, and I've dragooned myself into this book itself, so I shouldn't feel embarrassed talking about this, but every time, there's a self-consciousness when I talk about myself, because there's a murdered woman at the heart of this book, and her decimated family. But for me and my brother, it became a portal of periodic reflection on our adolescence, because James Duggan, his culture was certainly my brother's, and in many ways it was mine as well. But my interest in the story then evolved beyond that personal proximity.
At the very top of the book, where you're evaluating whether to contact Fran and Marie Ryle, Rebecca's bereaved parents, you quote Janet Malcolm's now very well-worn line about what journalists do being ethically indefensible. Probably a lot of people in this room would know it. Journalists justify their treachery in various ways according to their temperaments. The more pompous talk about freedom of speech and the public's right to know, the least talented talk about art, the seemliest murmur about earning a living. But I thought, instead of really going into your motives, you quote from the Facebook message that you sent them. And you wrote to the Ryles, "What I'm interested in, and what the book's real focus is how individuals and institutions make sense of tragic and senseless acts. I'm interested in your thoughts on justice and psychology, and I'm interested in how you have coped, and I'm interested in writing something which will suitably honour your loss." You're interested. 4 times interested. In our lives we get interested in lots of different things. And since you've brought this up, I want to know, what was the real reason that you wanted their cooperation? Wasn't that just a story that you were telling the Ryles?
Yeah, my editor at the Saturday paper read an early draft of this, and there's no editing whatsoever in my reproducing that correspondence with the Ryles. I haven't taken out a word. If the Ryles had asked me to redact what at the time was private correspondence, then I would, on their behalf. And my editor said that's brave. It's an overused word. It wasn't. It's not actually brave, but that's how he described it. Because he realised that all journalism is trespass. It's a favoured line of my editor at the Saturday paper. And he realised in that correspondence there was a level of manipulation there. I'm appealing to them by suggesting my sincere interest, my faithfulness to their pain. But I'm doing all of this without having met them. Now, I meant all of those things, but it's still a performance. That initial correspondence before you've established a rapport is performative in a way. And it was sort of cathartic, or at least an opportunity for the readers to see the kind of dirty work. I don't think it was particularly grubby or anything, what I did, but readers can see what happens before, because normally journalists will write a book, and it's this shiny artifact. Their authority is meant to be accepted without question, and you don't see the mechanics of actually getting that story. So a little bit of this book is, or are, those mechanics of first getting the story. But my interest was sincere. There were a few things about it. One was the details of the killing itself, which was head-scratchingly bizarre. Come sentencing time, you fast forward, there's this bewildered irritation that's shared by counsel and the judge as to the motivation of James Duggan's crime. And there's a bewildered irritation about the opacity, the inadequacy of the psychological assessments of James Duggan. That too fascinated me, as did his behaviour immediately after the killing. But the Ryles themselves, before I got to meet them and genuinely found them to be phenomenal people, and my interest turned into almost a love for them. Before that, it was their decision to stay in the same house. So Rebecca was murdered 6 months after they emigrated from England, and 50 metres from their house. And from the driveway of their house, you can see the plaque of remembrance that's placed at the side of her death, 50 metres away. And Rebecca was murdered in 2004. In 2016, the Ryles still lived there. One of my interests was to ask them why.
The other thing that you said to the Ryles asked you, as quite a lot of people do, if they'll be able to read what you've written. And you say, no, independence is a core ethic of the job. I dare say I've fallen back in that line a few times myself, but why is that? Is that just a convenience for us? Is that just a way of avoiding our common humanity?
Genuinely, I speak to a reasonable amount to young journalists and student journalists, and they often need help untangling these kind of ethical knots of access. And my unhelpful response to them is it's something you develop intuitively. You can find textbooks on media ethics, but out there it's not going to help you. You have to rely on, hopefully, a base level of decency. And you have dueling responsibilities. You have contradictory responsibilities. So on one hand, I have a responsibility to treat this family with dignity. They're profoundly traumatized. This is their suffering. They've experienced it. I'm simply thinking about it. My approach to it and my interest in it is essentially indulgent initially. So there's that responsibility to them. But the second responsibility, and I feel it genuinely, is to my own independence. That this is to be my work. I want it to be respectful. I want it to be thoughtful. I want it to be decent. I think I've achieved that. It's up for readers to decide. But I have to maintain my independence. And before having met them, I had to maintain those borders. But it was a position I renounced. I got to know them and got to trust them, and my trust was rewarded. My trust was vindicated because it got to the point where our rapport then sort of transformed into friendship. And I knew that their reading of the manuscript, they would not interfere. If there were changes, there would be respectful changes, there'd be matters of fact, and that's how it was. But initially, before we had met, I had to assert that independence.
We'll get back to that issue about the closeness with your subjects later on. Murder holds up a mirror which reveals its environment's ugliest features. A murder in high society seems to reveal the decadence of that society. A murder in the middle class reveals the falseness of the veneer of respectability. Murder in the inner city might be described in terms of kind of urban volatility. Murder in the country might be to do with loneliness and isolation. But is murder genuinely revelatory of its scene, or is it just that our response kind of summons up the phantoms of the imagination that we hold about these places?
Yeah, it's such as a prurient interest, a very lurid interest. And I love that question because it's a window on this passionate gripe I have about the vast majority of true crime. It's salacious junk. And often the authors will kind of exculpate themselves by making appeals, like Janet Malcolm said, to art, to instruction. But simply they're offering entertainment. We transform others' tragedy and we transform barbarism into entertainment. And murder itself is largely not revelatory on itself. The consequences are. But in this case, or we find something especially fascinating about a killer, that they're aberrantly other and there's some sort of transfixation with that. But in my experience, I used to work at Victoria Police, and I spent a lot of time speaking with senior police officers, homicide detectives. their stories to me were similar to what criminologists would tell me and psychologists would tell me in the research of this book, which is the inner lives of murderers are rarely interesting. They're not sociopaths. They're people who are inarticulate, and by that I don't mean expressively. I mean emotionally inarticulate, incapable of controlling passions, easily provoked, and murder at a time is either impetuous or seems like an answer to a problem. Exceptionally banal people, and Duggan was that banal person. His inner life was scorched earth. There was this chilling vacancy to him. The inner lives of Rebecca's family were far more interesting, and dare I use your word, revelatory.
The suburban milieu that you describe is quite darkly violent, but I wondered, are there a disproportionate numbers of violent crimes in that particular area?
No. I was sort of at pains to not... There was a subculture there, and I think if you participated in that subculture, it could become all-consuming. There was an insularity there. But the streets I grew up in the middle class, it's still the mortgage belt. There were some socioeconomic distinctions between certain suburbs. Proximity to the coast would tend to determine that. But the streets weren't engulfed in violence or flames. It was a subculture. It was fiercely generated, fiercely continued, but you could easily escape it.
Right.
You could grow up in those areas and probably not know much about it. But it's not like, like I say, engulfed in violence or random assaults. Much of the violence, Rebecca, unfortunately, is not such a case, but it was discriminatory. So it was committed between gangs, petty violence, opportunistic theft, escalating, though, to very serious assaults using baseball bats and knives. But principally, it was upon those who participated in these graffiti crews. But I don't think there's proportionate violence. But if you're inside it, it becomes all-consuming. And I have to be very careful talking... I need to make a distinction between causation and context. And James Duggan's crime, the context of that, were these gangs, this rotten masculinity, hyper-masculine projects, hyper-masculine conceptions of themselves, with little parental interference or guidance. And these were very strong, powerful will, and the consequences could be very, in this case, extreme. But that was the context of my brother's life. It was the context of this crime particularly.
Why aren't there more murders? We're drawn to murder. We're kind of fascinated by murder because of its exceptionality. Why does force almost invariably stop short of lethality?
In these suburbs or in...
Yeah.
Duggan, it's hard to extrapolate from this because we are left with a murder without motive. In Duggan's case, the actual lethality is particularly chilling. So you don't have an impetuous... I don't mean to downplay any act of murder. It'd be kind of ridiculous for me to do that. But the lethality in this case is particularly chilling because James strangled Rebecca. And the forensics team, this would have been the most important evidence tendered in the trial, was that to kill somebody in such a fashion requires a minimum of 3 minutes sustained pressure. So we're talking there about a seemingly bottomless rage, which even James Duggan might not have known existed until he had done this. It's not an impetuous act with a knife or a blunt instrument that might take a second. We're talking sustained. Now, happily, we don't seem to have too many people where this inchoate anger, this frustration, this profound inarticulacy that Duggan was kind of stained with is actually manifest so lethally. But we're left in this case with just the act itself, how sustained that force was, reflects just a profound anger committed against someone he had just met.
Let's turn to Rebecca Ryle. She's 19 years old. She's been in Australia for 6 months. How much about Rebecca Ryle has been constructed retrospectively? It's a social nicety that we don't speak ill of the dead. Isn't it true that those who die tragically often take on angelic guises?
The short answer is yes. And associated with that, I've often said, discussing this book, when I flatter Rebecca, when I speak so fulsomely about Rebecca's family, I feel like the audience feels like it's obliging.
Yes.
That one, we don't speak ill of the dead, and two, the Ryles have effectively gifted me a book by sharing their nervous system and being such incredibly eloquent narrators of their suffering. And when I praise them, I feel like the audience must have a little bit of cynicism in them. The author is obligingly flattering them because he realizes what they've given me. It happens to be sincere. As for Rebecca, I can't speak to what guided people's reflections.
Did you feel any sense of identification with her? Visitors still to come to terms with their environment. You write of yourself, I was there but not there, able to fit in without knowing why I didn't. I thought, that sounds a little bit like her own experience as a kind of a fish out of water. Was she groping her way in an unfamiliar place? And does that explain, in fact, why she went off with James Duggan that night?
That was probably the only bit of very personal overlap with Rebecca. Thinking about Rebecca was homesick. They'd only moved 6 months before, and they'd moved from a reasonably industrialised town in the north of England, Bolton, just near Manchester, and they'd moved to Mindarie, which I don't know how many here have been to Perth, but it's it's in the metropolitan area, about 40 minutes north of Perth, the CBD. And it's a strange place. It's brand new, like many of those suburbs, and it seems to stretch endlessly along this kind of glorious coastline. But there's a sort of chilling uniformity to it. It's sun-bleached. They were very close to the coast, which was charming for them, but it was very different. And Rebecca was very homesick. And as gregarious as she was, and uniformly described as gregarious, her parents also knew she was homesick. Yeah. And at the time of her death, she was saving money at a local supermarket so she could go back and visit friends. Her best friend was pregnant back in Bolton. So there was a certain discomfort that Rebecca had. That was what I shared with her, certainly.
Is that why she went off with James Duggan that night?
The parents' belief there is that she was an exceptionally trusting person. Right. It's interesting because Duggan seems to have had few charms about him. He wasn't a charming individual. No. He's not someone capable of putting on one show and turning into another. Rebecca was very trusting. Witnesses do say that they did seem, however, to establish a rapport at the boats. And if someone had asked to walk her home, I don't think she was the person who would feel comfortable turning that offer down. Right.
James Duggan was also born in England. His parents, however, were divorced. Likewise, his mother was separated from his stepfather. You tell us, word was that James was weird around girls. Whose word is that? And frankly, what adolescent is not weird around girls?
True. Earlier, I disclosed my own awkwardness in such matters in high school. The word came from many people that I spoke to, both on and off record, about James Duggan. So, it came up in the trial as well, during sentencing.
How much of that, again, is retrospectively constructed to accommodate his identity as a murderer?
Yeah, that question itself we could speak to for about an hour, because there's this profound and painful dependence upon witness statements. So there's certain things that you can corroborate. Sure. You yourself would know the awesome richness of court transcripts. And there's a myriad witnesses telling the same story from completely different angles. Yes. There's a great richness to that, and it's corroborated, and then you can track down the people and kind of test their own. There's a certain level of rigor that you can apply to it. But in other areas, there's this sort of dangerous faith that you must take in people's recollections. And there's a bit in this book about the frailty of memory itself, largely as it's applied to investigative interviews. But in detective handbooks, they speak about investigative interviewing and how fragile, how malleable, how suspect memory is. And to go to your question specifically, one, people's recollections are tainted by time, but they're also tainted by what had happened. And I think as memory is subject to our own biases, once you've established the monstrosity of Duggan, I think then memories of Duggan before the crime start bending towards that gravity. And I'm aware of that, but you can mitigate it only so much. And the hope is that you speak to enough people that patterns begin to emerge.
I wondered about the influence of crime fiction on crime fact. Crime fiction's constructed so as to provide us with clues by which we might nut the crime out ourselves that in hindsight seem obvious to us. Is that the way people have responded to the crime of James Duggan, do you think? That in hindsight it was always obvious that he would kill?
Yeah, things turn. There seems to be this inevitability after the fact. Hindsight turns everyone into geniuses. There's also the fact in that memory and the gravity of this crime bending it, how I've bended memories by asking questions as well, like the interference of the journalist. And I wonder how the Ryle's recollections of certain events are now bent by what they told me and they're recording in the book. So the book now makes it this kind of artifact of immovable fact, observable. But I think it's only going to be reinforced by the book itself. I found... There's this incredible story the Ryles told me on the night of Rebecca's murder. And, of course, they lived across the road. And a detective had taken them to a nearby hospital for sedatives. And she'd taken them back home, made sure that they'd taken the sedatives before leaving. And the police officer, the detective, who was on the family liaison officer, she was worried about a number of things, self-harm being one of them. But the other was this hysterical pilgrimage to collect Rebecca's body. And Fran and Marie both told me the story about Marie rising, her terror breaking the grip of the sedative, and then Fran subsequently waking to her sobbing. And she was saying, I'm going to get my baby, I'm going to get my baby. And as they told the story, they still remembered Rebecca's body being in the park still, and there would be this kind of great reclamation of her body. But Rebecca had been taken to the morgue by that point, but still 8 years on, they believed that her body was still there. Now, through court documents, I could find that. But you wonder what else might get through, and you wonder also how you're asking the questions and the representation of a book, because it seems so authoritative, starts bending people's memories as well.
Did you ever meet Luke Richards?
The petrol station attendant. I spent a lot of time with Luke,
Because I actually think the most disturbing section of the book is not the murder itself, but the bit where James reappears at 12:55 a.m. at the mobile service station, talks to Luke Richards, buys a sandwich, a porno, some M&M figurines while he's waiting for a taxi. What's going on here?
Yeah, I probably omitted that from talking about my initial interest in the book, because that I couldn't stop thinking about that. Before meeting the Ryles are the heart and soul of this book. Before I met the Ryles, that was a big thing. Why had they stayed in the house? And why had Duggan behaved the way he did afterwards? There was this chilling normalcy to it. And Duggan, in all of the kind of testimony of people that knew him, including my brother, I didn't get the profile that this was someone that could affect normalcy in a period of exceptional stress and anxiety and presumably existential nausea. He's just murdered a woman. And here he is going into a petrol station, which he doesn't need to go to. He can just walk home. So he's placing himself on CCTV. There's the petrol station attendant as a witness as the subsequent taxi driver. He waits there for a full hour, speaking gregariously. He's so normal, in fact, that Luke Richards, when he speaks to detectives the next day, is certain the detectives have it wrong. Of all the people, the meth heads, the thieves, the guys brawling in the car park, of all the people that he had suffered the night before, and could have been a suspected killer, it wasn't Duggan. Now, that remains as achingly kind of inexplicable to me as it did to psychologists, as it did to psychiatrists, as it did to legal counsel. Back at the time, I distantly and amateurishly assumed psychopathy. That if you could affect that normalcy, or actually be normal, not affect it, but because there's this profound emptiness of a vacancy of empathy, I distantly surmise that. But there's a battery of psychological examination when you commit a murder. He was subject to at least 4 examinations that I know of, and it yielded nothing aberrant about him psychologically. So there's a few mysteries in this book, and I think that's a part of the book, is that irresolution is the point. It's not, when we ask for resolution, we're asking for entertainment. You know, we want our real life to be the same as a fiction. There's no beginning, middle, and end here. There's these great holes, these great mysteries. Those mysteries compound the Ryle's suffering, and they don't get any resolution. So the readers don't either.
Interesting. James is arrested so momentarily as his friend Gareth. There's an excerpt from the interview which I find quite haunting, where James begins to divulge what he was up to the previous night, and the detective says, "Can you continue on?" James says, "I have to." Detective, why do you have to? James, to get it out. Detective, you understand you are not obliged to answer any of my questions. James, I understand. Detective, so you want to get it out? James, yes. Detective, why? James, because I want to know why I did it. I feel bad that here the words become garbled. Now, I'm struck by these exchanges. Why does he want to get it out, as he says? If we could have heard those garbled words, what would they have been, or what did they express?
There's 2 things I'll say about that. As close to explaining himself, and there are many, many, many hours of police interviews, including one about 2 weeks after that in remand at Haigh prison. As close to explaining himself that James gets in these police interviews is things were spinning round and round and round.
I freaked out.
And I freaked out. And that's about as specific, detailed, articulate as James gets as to the matter of killing Rebecca. Detectives have told me that that's not unusual, that unless you're a sociopath, killers can talk fairly volubly about what happened up to the murder and what happened after, but the thing itself is either trauma has made you an amnesiac about it, or you simply refuse to speak of it. Now, the second thing is James says to them, I want to keep going. I need to know how I've done this. That does, I should say, come after many hours of denial. But I think what kind of puts the lie to that somewhat is you juxtapose that with the interview he conducts 2 weeks later, and he's petulant and defiant again. He's completely uncooperative, and he does not seem like a young man that cares at all to figure out why he did this. That this extremely painful inner examination seems like the last thing in his mind. So he offers some sort of window of tenderness, or at least some appeal to himself for introspection, but that doesn't last long. And in the subsequent interview, he's petulant and defiant yet again. And that seemed to be the constant tone of him.
Here's James. He says, Gareth had nothing to do with this. I walked up to the park with Rebecca and we sat on the bollards and started kissing, and the next thing I know, I started choking her. I left her there and ran off and went to Mobile and dumped the jacket. Now, you tell us that the Ryles refused to believe that they kissed, and eventually you draw the same conclusion. Why? Here were 2 lonely 19-year-olds who spent the evening together. Rebecca had ignored several opportunities to leave James's company. She clearly thought he was safe. Is it really so implausible that they did kiss? And if they did kiss, what would it matter anyway? It makes no difference to the heinousness of the crime. Yet it seems to me that your final reconstruction falls in implicitly with the story that the Ryles have told themselves. Is your relationship with them a factor in that? Does it go back to your original promise to write something that would honour their daughter, with the inference perhaps that her honour will be preserved?
You're good, Gideon. Oh boy. I was saying to my partner coming here, I'm like, there's going to be at least one tricky question from Gideon. But before, it's been like an unbroken boulevard of green lights. As I've stolen that from Alec Baldwin. I've wondered that myself. So you asked me a few things. We'll go from the start.
Yeah, sure.
It's not implausible. No, of course not. But had she been briefly intimate with her killer, as you say, that does not change the heinousness of the act one bit. Second, the Ryles. They necessarily, I think almost necessarily, psychologically, it's a psychological necessity for them to believe that their daughter was not briefly intimate. Sure. You know, that's a protective mechanism, if you will, and a completely acceptable one. Now, the more difficult question is whether or not, consciously or unconsciously, my sympathy meant that my speculation became aligned with the Ryles. Possibly, is the short answer. I speculatively recreate a scene that's been told through rigor initially. So the initial recreation of the scene is through court documents, my interviews, et cetera, and then there's this speculative reimagining. I struggled with that because James seems so inexplicable, I think, to himself and to anyone observing him, that you could have almost said anything, that the emptiness of it there is a vacuum that people are going to fill themselves, and the Ryles themselves are going to fill with protective theories. Now, possibly I have done that, and I'm grateful that's come up, actually, because I think in all of the irresolution and all of the chilling mysteries in this book, how we explain... This is actually going to be what the book was initially about, and I kind of veered off, but there was this Ron Rosenbaum book called Explaining Hitler. And it's not so much about Hitler, but interpreters of Hitler. Historians, other sundry academics, theologians, Freudians, other psychiatrists. And he said that at the heart of Hitler, there's this aching question as to his motivation on the Jewish question, and that we still don't have an answer. Some say that he was sincere in his rectitude, others that he was a charlatan, a mountebank, and that the Jewish question was simply used to cynically coalesce power. Now, in that vacuum, Rosenbaum says heaps of people explain it in different ways. And in doing so, we explain ourselves, not the thing we attempt to explain. This was mine, and I probably have said much more about myself, which is revealing a sympathy with the Ryles. Now, that said, discussions with people who knew James spoke about, as I said before, that weirdness with girls. My brother had felt that this was one rejection too many. It was the final rejection. It was smuggled in with misogyny. It had also accumulated. Duggan did not have the emotional capacity to respond with any maturity to any sense of rejection. So whilst it conforms to the Ryles, it conforms with many, many other people's theories as well. And it's funny, this QC was in touch with me just today. He just finished the book, and he said that he'd encountered many killers in his time in the courts, whereby there's this little laugh, he said, a little laugh, a tittering by a female victim. It is nervous laughter, but it's interpreted by the thug as this profound rejection, as this belittlement. This was something the Silk had seen a lot of. So there's a partial defense of myself, but I think there's a lot to what you say, because I had become very close to them. And at that point, arguably, my independence started to erode. That very thing that I was so assertive about protecting up front started to change.
The book's also being written at a very particular stage in your life. You say, these days, friends who know these suburbs are surprised by my descriptions of them, finding them to be almost unrecognisable. Has the murder, do you think, at some subconscious level, legitimated your desire to escape the suburbs? Yeah,
there's those friends that I speak of, they grew up at the same time, but we didn't know each other then, if that makes sense. So we've kind of become friends later, and by happenstance had shared suburbs. They were brighter kids with brighter futures than I had at that time. You know, I was kicking about... not necessarily a hooligan, but the bright kids and the disciplined kids and those with, more stable homes, they could escape all of that. They were at home watching Seinfeld, forming bands in the garage. You know, that's what they were doing. And so that's what my friends now were doing. And they weren't in graffiti crews. They didn't see knives and stabbings and this and that. So it's unrecognizable because this world played out parallel. The streets weren't engulfed. And second... the number of people that have come to me and said, I recognize my high school, I recognize the certain dread of the suburbs. I think there was a certain pretension in my rejection of the suburbs when I had left them, when I was 22. And I later came to be kind of chastened by my pretentious rejection of them. But when I go up there, I'm still like, there's still something to that. I still find this kind of dread. And people are writing that to me all of the time. This kind of... This horribly volatile cocktail of boredom in young men.
You tell us that you wrote to James Duggan but that you say he routinely ignored my letters. How often did you try, and what did you feel when he didn't reply?
I've got lucky, I think, in that. I wrote maybe 3 or 4 times. I'd written to his lawyer as well, or his past lawyer, and his lawyer said that his cooperation was conditional upon James's. So, it would start with James.
Yeah.
And obviously, Duggan was under no obligation whatsoever to correspond, and he didn't.
How did you feel?
Initially frustrated. Yeah, initially frustrated, because you want as much access as possible. I mean, that's what journalists trade in, is access. That's the holy grail. And the book would have been different. But I now realize that it was kind of serendipitous. Yeah. Now, this might simply be me rationalizing an absence, but I think it's serendipitous because I think Duggan's absence in the book is actually powerfully metaphorical.
Yes.
It's powerfully symbolic. Yes. There's this profound emptiness and vacancy within Duggan himself, within the act, this completely senseless act. The consequences aren't meaningless, but the act itself is this profound vacancy within Duggan and his crime. Duggan doesn't have that much to share. And I think people...
But how do you know, Martin? How do you know?
Well,
you've never looked him in the eye.
No, I say at the end, off record, I spoke to some people who'd visited him in prison.
I found this you got a very interesting glimpse of him. You say that in jail he grew during his incarceration between arrest and trial because he's been working in the gym.
Right.
I find that kind of interesting. So in an all-male environment where he's not reminded of his social awkwardness, where he's spared the humiliation of female rejection, he becomes more like our visual conception of a man, powerful, dominating, and he's also safe. What does that tell us about James Duggan?
Well, possibly safe. There was one thing we learned about Duggan quite late in writing the book. The Ryles are... One of their great fears is Duggan's release. Late last year, as a small, quick tangent, the immigration minister said that he'd just not become an Australian citizen, fell short by about 6 months before he was arrested. So he'll be deported upon finishing his sentence. Profound relief to the Ryles. Now, the Ryles are informed of parole decisions and prisoner transfers, and that's it, not for the reasons for them. Right. But Duggan's most recent transfer was back to Casuarina, which is the toughest prison in Perth, one of the toughest in Australia. He had spent the majority of his sentence down in Albany. It's about 6 hours south of Perth. Now, his transfer coincided exactly with a riot in that prison. And the belief was that Duggan had participated in this riot. But the Ryles, despite what had happened to them, aren't given the details. But we surmised from a few other things as well that the Department of Corrections had sent the Ryles. We inferred that Duggan was involved in these riots. And so from that, you wonder if his violence has simply sharpened. And his physicality is unfortunately more intimidating now.
What's been the effect on those in James's circle? His mother and father, his stepfather. We hear from Gareth Phillips, his friend. He gives you a gruff advice that James has already fucked up my life. Aren't the others part of this tragedy too? Aren't they victims? Especially so, given that they invite not our sympathy but our kind of moral scolding.
Yeah, there's a number of people. I don't know if you've found this. This is a man who's written 31 books, so... There's a number of people I wanted to contact and couldn't. They were just dead ends. Sure. And they've now found me because the book's come out. Right. And I keep thinking, where were you then? So you've experienced this? Yeah. And I'm like, oh my God. But it suggests a paradox that you need a book to have, that's happened quite a bit. I wanted to know more of his friends. Duggan, at the point of murdering Rebecca, had largely estranged himself. He was not socially gifted. He was thieving from friends. He was lying to them. He was a pain in the arse. And by that point, Gareth Phillips is one of his last few friends who was dragooned into this. Police arrested him as well. And for a little while, there was some suspicion that he might have been involved. He was subsequently exonerated, though. But yes, and so it has affected them. There was one person who, a chap called Liam, who was friends with Duggan, and he... It's funny because they were 19 then, and he's 30 now. He's a man. And Liam is this very reflective guy. He had escaped that scene that was so ugly, so vicious, so banal. And Liam offered me his reflections. But this is something that all the people that I've spoken to, but all of the other sort of peripheral characters that have now gotten in touch with me now the book is out, none of them have forgotten this at all, ever. It's still painful to recollect their proximity to a killer. And I think it asks them to ask hard questions about themselves.
It's interesting that elapsure of time, isn't it? I mean, you developed a strong and trusting bond with the Ryles. They're clearly very special people in your life. Have you reflected on how different this book might have been if you'd written it contemporaneously? If you'd written it, say, in 2007, 2011?
I started writing it 2004 very briefly, and I say in there pretentiously, you know, like I wanted to interpret the crime as a matter of literary significance. There's this kind of callowness there. It kind of disgusts me to think about it now. Had I written it back then, I wouldn't have been as strong a writer. I don't know if I would have established a rapport with the Ryles. The Ryles are everything to this book. It really is a sustained meditation on suffering, I think. Yes. And however, like purely journalistically, the longer you get away from something, the harder it is to find records, to find people. People move away, people die, people's recollections become hazier. So the closer to it you are, the better. But I think when I started writing it, I was probably at a nice point of maturity.
Janet Malcolm, in an interview with the Paris Review, concluded that malice is journalism's animating instinct and that it is not one of the caring professions. Yet I don't feel that here. If anything, I suspect that the Ryles would describe you as having had a therapeutic effect on their lives. But if Janet Malcolm's going to be our approved provider of hot takes on journalism, does that mean you failed in your job?
That's fine. I adore Janet Malcolm. She's phenomenal. She's a phenomenal intellect. But I'm very happy with how I got to know the Ryles. I mean, they're friends now. It's something I'm very, very proud of. And I think I'm very lucky to have met people. You just do not find people. Suffering is ineffable for most people. It's something that cannot be articulated. I was so lucky to find people that can discuss profound suffering so eloquently and so generously. I say in the book that they gave their nervous systems, and they truly did. So to me, I got lucky to receive that.
It's your opportunity to get lucky. Ladies and gentlemen, your opportunity to ask a question of Martin McKenzie-Murray at the KYD Book Club.
Hi. So my questions, I suppose, are around your initial interest. So what piqued your interest in following this case further were those two concepts. Why did this gentleman go to the service station afterwards, and why did the family stay living in the residence after their daughter was killed? So I suppose my question is about whether you feel like that interest was satiated, whether you got those answers to those questions.
To the first, the bizarre behaviour in the petrol station, his geniality, his purchase of a sandwich, a can of Coke, a light porno magazine, a car trinket despite him not driving. These remain for psychologists, for lawyers, for the police, possibly for Duggan himself, inexplicable. Like I said earlier, I initially amateurishly surmised psychopathy. The short answer is I don't know. The second thing, as to the Ryles, again, distantly and amateurishly, I surmised that it was deeply unhealthy, that it suggested this kind of fixation and incapacity to move on. I spoke to a trauma psychologist, and she said to me, it's not in the book, but she said to me that it seemed in fact very healthy, that there wasn't this avoidance of the thing, that they could embrace it. It's profoundly transfigured. It's become a sacred site. But that they could embrace it, this psychologist suggested to me it was healthy. Now, what the Ryles themselves said to me, which convinced me that it was also healthy, was that, yes, there's this sense of not being able to let Rebecca go, but they can also speak honestly about how they use that word, irrational. And they said, but we're happy with that irrationality. But here's the healthy bit. Fran said to me, the reasons for them moving to Australia still stood. Better schools for their kids, the weather, the climate, economic opportunity, the culture, all of those things still stood. They enjoyed the proximity to the beach. Fran's got a shed out the back and a pool. None of this happened in England, which they had grown almost contemptuous of. And I thought that was immensely healthy, that independent of the tragedy, the reasons for them moving to Australia still stood.
I'm just interested in your characterization of James as a banal sort of a guy who didn't have anything in him, compared to a sociopath. And I would remind you of the description of Eichmann, Hannah Arendt calling, the banality of evil. What's the difference between James and a sociopath?
Eichmann always comes up. As an aside, Hannah, I just feel obliged to say this, Hannah Arendt was history's worst court reporter. A wonderful philosopher, but Eichmann left a trail of evidence as to his pathological contempt for Jews. Yeah. His defense as being this kind of hapless bureaucrat was a sham, which Arendt bought. Anyway, apologies.
That's true.
So yes, so sociopathy I think is defined as this. I mean, this isn't the specific definition, but there's this chilling pathological vacancy of empathy. By Duggan's emptiness, I mean that there's just little interesting. There's not much of an interior life other than lust, other than anger, other than frustration. He couldn't stand rejection. He was quite a forlorn and pathetic figure. And his emptiness, there's stuff in there, but it's banal and kind of cheap and juvenile. The inner life is not textured, it's not interesting like the Ryles. But it's not empty in the sense that there's nothing there, like the sociopaths, that there's no empathy. Does that distinction?
There's one interesting aspect, I think, of the crime. You say the spectre of sex watched over the trial of James Duggan. The lower half of her body was stripped, but she wasn't sexually assaulted. Many now think that she was. Why? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that.
Why do you think she wasn't?
You were talking about the various kind of the frailty of memory, and it shifts its contour, and now people remember simply the disrobing, and now it's become fossilized, and we have these sort of. Rebecca was not sexually assaulted. In fact, Duggan eventually confessed to killing Rebecca. It would still go to trial because counsel couldn't determine the particular charge. Whilst he would eventually confess to the killing, he never confessed to disrobing her, and in conjunction with his lawyer offered a third party coming along. The judge, though, would find that he had. Now, there you have... no one knows. It's just... It's so dark. Some interpretations from lawyers have been that the sort of denuding of Rebecca was to suggest a random rape attack, and his normality afterwards was in fact affected to give him an alibi, but he was naive and clumsy, and he left a trail of culpability. Those who knew Duggan sort of feel the same as well, that he was actually manipulating this. Rather than it being sexual perversity, he was manipulating the scene to throw police off the chase, however clumsily and however crazy that sounds. So that's one suggestion. And it was suggested again to me today by this QC that was in touch. That was his interpretation of it, but it's purely speculative.
What sort of book do you think you would have written if you hadn't had that connection with the Ryles and hadn't had that, respect and admiration for them?
I was really surprised when I was going through final drafts to go back to my emails that I'd written to them, and I said something like, this is how memory conforms to expectations and it bends and rearranges to your best ideas of yourself. When I'd become friends with the Ryles, I couldn't then imagine a time when I would have simply treated them like a source. And I told them in an initial correspondence, I can't remember the exact line, but something like, it suggested that I wouldn't require their cooperation, was essentially the sentiment. And I was actually really surprised at myself. And my memory had changed. I remembered it differently, that I was kind of asking permission, essentially. That's how I remembered it, because that's what conformed or aligned with my eventual friendship with them. So I was actually really surprised by that. And secondly, and hopefully this speaks to your question, I can't imagine the book now without the Ryles. I can't. I don't think there would have been one. They are such exceptional people. Our intimacy is a part of the book, but really what they gave of themselves, how tragedy denudes this life, their relationship to pleasure, Fran's very eloquent comparison of the trauma he felt in the Falklands War, he's a war veteran, to losing Rebecca, the impact upon their sex lives. They talk about all of this philosophically, candidly. The fact of them still being together is extraordinary. So now, I mean, I would have told you something different starting the book. I would have plowed ahead. But now, thinking of the book without the Ryles, I can't think of it existing.
I mean, must have been a horrendous experience for her. Didn't she fight back in any way? Wasn't he scratched or, you know?
She was a young woman and a very trusting woman. From all testimony, or however tender testimony, no, I don't believe Duggan had sustained any injuries. Right. Well, at least 3 minutes sustained choking, yes. But Rebecca may have lost consciousness before that point, though. But in short, no.
You said you didn't actually meet with James. Did you have an expectation of how that exchange would go if you had met him? I'm sure you must have built it up in your mind to be something. And
yeah. When you wrote to him, what did you say?
Yeah.
You've quoted your correspondence with the Ryles, but you haven't quoted your communication with Duggan. What did you tell him?
No. From memory, I told him that this was an opportunity for him to tell his story, so that the book would go ahead regardless. Hinting, hoping that he would get the inference that it's not going to be a very flattering portrayal of him, having been convicted of murder. And so that this was an opportunity. I don't stress it, I don't state it so baldly, but that this would be an opportunity for him to tell his side of the story. I also asked him if he might like to share what his time in prison had been like. And there's a certain manipulation to that. You know, there's a certain appeal. I didn't say I'd publish it all or I'm going to glorify you or anything like that. I simply said this is an opportunity for you to tell your story. I mean, that can be very powerful for people, that opportunity. So one, about what had happened, but I also included in there that I'd be interested in his time in prison and how he felt that he had changed and how prison had changed him. So it was about that, and it was quite short. I didn't lecture him or hector him. And then I waited. And then I probably waited 6 months before writing him again. But of course, I didn't hear back.
Do you know whether he received the letters? Do you know whether he's aware of the book?
Well, I can only assume. I mean, the letters were never returned.
Right.
So I can only assume he received them. And that's all I know. Sorry, there was a second part to your question. Yeah, I had anticipated a little bit. I was prepared to fly back to Perth. I'd done a number of trips for research to meet people, police, witnesses, etc. Obviously, Rebecca's family I spent a lot of time with over there. I was prepared to go over there and fly to Perth and meet him in prison. And beyond that, that's all I had thought. Yeah, but that was it.
Maybe just a follow-up question to that. Do you think the fact that your brother had beaten him up might have influenced his decision to speak to you?
Well picked up. We have a very distinctive surname. And I'm trying to remember if I had mentioned Cameron in my letters. I don't think I did. But I assumed that the surname would be familiar to him. Many years had passed, but I assumed the name would be familiar to him. And so, yes, possibly. To be honest with you, I was more worried about Cameron upon Duggan's eventual release. And it's something that we spoke about a lot. I was more worried about it than Cameron was. Happily, Duggan won't be released in Australia, so... but that was actually a concern of mine, yeah.
Just wanted to know something. In the light of the recent, you must have heard of a serial podcast with Adnan Syed, the trial of Adnan Syed in Baltimore, and also Netflix is Making a Murderer. Do you think after the book that you've written, the killer will become a public figure when he's released? Do you think public perception about him is going to change? Because it's so much under scrutiny. Do you think all of us, when we read your book, are going to analyze and think, hey, look, there's something that must have gone wrong in the trial. Maybe he's not the killer. Maybe he's denying it. Maybe he accepted it. He was coerced into it. Do you think that's going to be, or have you had that reaction already?
I guess there's a few things to say about that. One, my book won't be the international phenomenon that podcast was. So, you know, that created this international circus, which has caused great anguish to the families involved in that case. The journalists say that they couldn't have anticipated such a phenomenon in their defense. I don't think my book will be subject to that. Initially, the publication date kind of changed, as did the parole conditions of Duggan, and then ultimately he's going to be expelled from the country anyway. But there was a time when Duggan's release may have coincided with the release of my book, and I would have felt that would have been particularly uncomfortable for him. And then I thought about what consequences that might mean for me or my family. Beyond that, I just don't... There's enough of a gap upon Duggan's release, and Duggan will be released to England now. He won't be released in Australia. And the unfortunate thing is publishing... Books are ephemeral. You know, I think there'll be interest for a couple of months. It won't be sustained. Most people in Perth have, unfortunately, probably forgotten about Rebecca.
Wouldn't you say that any documentation from outside people in terms of looking at murders in true crime, wouldn't that, you said earlier that a lot of writing on the subject is entertainment. Wouldn't you say that any documentation of some is in some way turning it into a form of entertainment?
Possibly. This might seem like a grubby deflection, but I guess that's for the readers to decide. I think my book is undertaken with a certain intellectual seriousness and a certain decency and respect for the Ryles, and hopefully sensitively convey stuff that is just not told, which is the victim side of the story. I think when we turn barbarism into entertainment, we ignore the victim entirely. We often don't even know their name. I wanted this book to be a repudiation of that, as did the Ryles. And the family and I kind of aligned in our interests in offering Rebecca's legacy and offering their legacy of suffering and their very articulate narration of it. Hopefully that justifies itself. I think how much the Ryles... Other police have said this to me and other journalists, that the Ryles give so much of themselves that it's not a Hallmark card story. It's not mawkish. It's not sentimental. It's warts and all about their suffering, but it will be spiritually and emotionally instructive to fellow sufferers. And I think that's true. I think that's the Ryle's gift in this book. And hopefully that's the thing that makes it instructive rather than mere entertainment. But of course I want it to read well as well, you know. That needs to happen. And I care about style, I care about the sentences and the structure, but it goes well beyond that.
So in that case, the book has a motive, but perhaps not the murder. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this evening. As history was made in the first Kill Your Darlings book club, please put your hands together for Martin McKenzie-Murray.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.